An 87-year-old man walked into a Veterans Affairs office on a Tuesday morning at 9:47. His back was bent from age and old injuries. His hands trembled slightly as he held a folder. On his chest, beneath an open cardigan, he wore a row of medals: Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Medal, Combat Infantryman Badge, National Defense Medal, Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, Southwest Asia Service Medal, and dozens more. Each one represented something, a decision made under pressure. A soldier led safely home, a moment of command in chaos, a commitment to something larger than himself. Robert Thomas Harrison wasn't thinking about the medals that morning. He was thinking about Michael. Michael was his grandson, 28 years old. He'd come home from Afghanistan 3 years ago, missing the right arm from just above the elbow. An IED had taken it. Not his life. He was lucky about that. Though Michael didn't always feel lucky. The Veterans Affairs system had him on a waiting list for prosthetics. There was disability paperwork that needed filing. The system that was supposed to help veterans had become a maze that Michael couldn't navigate alone. So Harrison had come. Michael sat beside him now, looking at the form like it was written in a language that had nothing to do with English. His left arm held the paper flat. The right side of his body was just air where an arm used to be. He'd learned to adapt. He could do most things with one hand that other people needed two for. But paperwork was paperwork. It required organization and focus and the ability to not get angry at a government that had sent you to war and then made you fight bureaucracy just to get the help they'd promised. Grandpa Michael had said that morning, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Harrison had put his hand on his grandson's shoulder and said what grandfathers say. "You'd do fine, son, but I'm here. That's what family does." They were waiting for Carol, the receptionist. Carol was good at her job and kind about it. That was rarer than it should have been. She was pulling the file, getting the forms in the right order, making the process something Michael could actually accomplish. It would take 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then Harrison would drive Michael back home. Then Harrison would go to his own house and spend the evening the way he spent most evenings, reading about military history, watching the news, talking to old friends on the phone, going to bed at 9 because he slept better when he got up at 5. There was no point staying awake longer than necessary. Officer Thomas Garrett hadn't had a good morning. His wife had mentioned divorce again. Not in an angry way this time, in a tired way, which was somehow worse. They'd been married for 11 years, and somewhere around year 8, she'd stopped being his wife and started being someone who lived in the same house and tolerated him. He had 2 kids he barely saw during the week. He had a job that paid okay and gave him authority over people. That was the only thing that made him feel like he wasn't completely failing at life. His father had been a cop, a mean cop, the kind who came home and hit people. His mother sometimes, because that's how his father understood the world. Authority meant force. Control meant dominance. Power was something you used on people weaker than you. Garrett had never hit his wife. He'd never raised his hand in anger. But the work of being better than his father had been exhausting. Somewhere around year 5 of the police force, he'd stopped working at it so hard. What remained was a version of his father wearing a different uniform. He was 34 years old, 8 years on the Kentucky State Police, already beginning to understand that he'd made a fundamental mistake somewhere. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be a cop. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be anything. The Tuesday morning patrol hadn't helped. 3 hours of sitting in a car watching nothing happen, feeling his life get smaller and smaller. The supervisor had mentioned some training. That meant more hours away from home, more time with people he didn't respect, more hours fighting the anger that lived in his chest like something with its own heartbeat. When he got the call to do a welfare check at the Veterans Affairs office, it felt like salvation. something to do, somewhere to go. He parked the patrol car and walked in. The office was quiet. An old man and a young man with one arm sitting near the receptionist's desk. The receptionist, Carol, was at her desk looking at a computer. Quiet Tuesday morning. Nobody causing trouble. Nobody giving him a reason to do anything. Then he saw the medals. The old man was wearing them beneath an open cardigan. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. A whole string of decorations that seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light. Garrett's eyes caught on them. He didn't know what most of them were. He'd never served. But Garrett had inherited something from his father anyway. An intuition that when someone had something you didn't, you could make them feel small about it. The medals bothered him. They bothered him the way things bother people when they don't quite understand them. Garrett approached the desk. "Hey there. What's going on here?" Harrison looked up. There was something in his face. Not anger, not fear. Just a kind of calm recognition, like he'd seen this before. Young authority with a chip on its shoulder. He stood slowly and extended his hand. "Good morning, officer. We're just helping my grandson with some paperwork for his disability benefits." Garrett didn't shake his hand. He was looking at the medals. He pointed. "And what's all this service medal, sir?" "From various operations." Michael started to speak. "Sir, my grandfather served." "I'm not talking to you, kid. I'm talking to the old man." The office got quieter. Carol stopped typing. There was a tension now. The kind that appears when someone with authority decides to use it like a weapon. Garrett stepped closer to Harrison. Too close. He reached out and touched one of the medals. The Distinguished Service Medal. Harrison's most significant decoration. Earned for commanding a battalion of over 600 soldiers in the Gulf War, keeping every single one of them alive, bringing them home to families that thought they wouldn't see them again. These are real. Or are you one of those fake veterans, the kind that buys this stuff online? These are real officer, earned over 40 years. 40 years. Doing what? Exactly. Counting supply inventory. Carol stood up. "Officer, that's not appropriate. Stay out of this. I'm conducting an investigation." There was no investigation. Everyone in the room knew it. But Garrett had a badge. The badge meant he could define what was happening in this room however he wanted. He picked up the Distinguished Service Medal, physically removed it from Harrison's chest, held it in his hand, looked at it like it was a toy from a cereal box. "This one." "What's this one for?" "Command of a battalion in Desert Storm. We had a successful operation that—" "Desert Storm." Garrett laughed. "That was ancient history. And you're still wearing them around like you saved the world. That's pathetic, man." "That's actually pathetic. You're an old guy wearing decorations for stuff nobody cares about anymore." The office was fuller now. 2 other people had come in. An older veteran waiting for an appointment. A younger woman in business casual who worked for the Veterans Affairs office. They watched. Nobody did anything. Because Garrett had a badge, and the badge meant something, and challenging it seemed impossible. Garrett returned the medal, but not gently. "You know what I think you should take these off. All this pride in old wars. It's embarrassing. It's un-American." Un-American Harrison's eyes met Garrett's for the first time with something other than calm recognition. That's an interesting word choice. Yeah. Dwelling on the past, bragging about ancient military service. That's what un-American looks like. Garrett stepped back, still smiling. The smile was the worst part. It meant he thought this was funny. It meant he thought he was winning. "You should be ashamed, old man. Really, you should be ashamed of yourself." The room held its breath. Everyone was watching Harrison now, waiting to see if he would break, if he would fight back, if he would give Garrett the confrontation he seemed to want. Instead, Harrison straightened his medals. One by one, he adjusted each one so it lay flat against his chest. It took him maybe 30 seconds. The silence filled with the gesture. When he was done, he looked at Garrett. "Thank you for your service, officer. Or perhaps you haven't served." The question hung in the air like something alive. Garrett's face hardened. "I serve every day as a police officer." "Yes, sir. That's a form of service. A different form. But it's service." There was something in Harrison's voice. Not condescension, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from having actually led people, actually made decisions under pressure, actually understood what it meant to have authority that wasn't about the badge, but about the responsibility that came with it. Garrett heard it. He didn't like it. "I'm going to remember this attitude, old man. And if I catch you causing any trouble at all, I'll be the first person to bring you in. I'll be watching." "Yes, sir. I understand, officer." Garrett turned and walked out. The door closed behind him, but the anger that followed him remained, like smoke in the room. Carroll approached Harrison as soon as Garrett was gone. "Sir, I'm so sorry about that. He can be difficult." "It's fine, Carroll. I've seen worse. Much worse." "Grandpa, that was wrong," Michael said. "He shouldn't be able to treat you like that." "No," Harrison agreed. "He shouldn't. But he did. And now we know who he is." It was a true statement. But Harrison didn't realize, couldn't have realized, that knowing who someone is doesn't protect you from what they do. Knowledge is just the beginning. It's the machinery that comes after that changes things. He had no idea that his name on that officer's memory was already beginning to trigger something much larger than either of them could anticipate, Michael told his father that evening. Colonel David Harrison listened to his son describe the scene. The mockery, the physical disrespect of touching the medals, the absurdity of being called un-American for wearing decorations earned in service. By the time Michael finished, David's jaw was clenched so tight his temples hurt. David called his father immediately. "Sir, I heard what happened at the Veterans Affairs office. I expected you would. News travels fast in small towns." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, David. It's just a police officer with a temper. It's not fine. He disrespected your service. He disrespected all of us." Robert could hear the anger in his son's voice. The same tone David had used when he was 10 and someone had been unfair to his sister. The protective fury that ran in the Harrison men like a genetic code. "Let it go, son. We don't need more conflict. You taught me never to let disrespect go unanswered." "I taught you a lot of things, David. I also taught you to pick your battles." But David was already making calls. He called his commanding officer, General Margaret Whitaker. He told her what happened. General Whitaker listened. When David was finished, there was a pause. "Your father is the General Robert T. Harrison." "Yes, ma'am. He trained my father. He was legendary. He still is, ma'am. Then we need to make sure this is handled correctly." The story spread through military channels like current through a circuit. A general, even a retired one, had been disrespected by a man with a badge. A man who didn't understand that disrespect to a general is disrespect to the entire military structure. The hierarchy had been challenged. The protocol had been violated. The one thing the military understands is order. Order meant that something had to happen in response. Garrett, in the meantime, went about his day as if nothing had changed. He told his fellow officers about the encounter. You should have seen this old guy. All these medals acting like he was somebody special, like wearing decorations from wars nobody remembers makes him important. Marcus, a younger cop who joined the force 2 years ago, went pale. He didn't say anything at first. Then, "That might not have been smart, Tom. Why, he's just an old man with delusions of grandeur." That old man is General Robert T. Harrison. He was the base commander at Fort Campbell before he retired. The blood drained from Garrett's face. How do you know that? Because my father served under him. And my father just called me asking if I was the one who disrespected him. Garrett didn't respond. He couldn't. The realization was still arriving, still settling into his consciousness like a stone sinking through water. He hadn't just mocked an old man. He'd mocked someone whose rank he didn't understand. Someone whose authority wasn't in a badge but in decades of actual command. Someone whose network of relationships stretched across the entire military structure. Meanwhile, Harrison did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He didn't complain. He didn't tell his story to the media. He didn't weaponize his rank. He simply went about his business with the kind of dignity that comes from having nothing left to prove. 2 days after the initial incident, he returned to the Veterans Affairs office. Alone, this time. He finished Michael's paperwork himself, methodically working through the forms with the same patience he'd used to mentor officers 40 years ago. Garrett was there, part of his regular patrol. When he saw Harrison, he turned away. But Harrison caught his eye briefly as he was leaving. He nodded. Not a gesture of forgiveness, but a gesture of clarity. I'm not your enemy. Garrett didn't nod back. Harrison's phone rang constantly. Retired generals calling from across the country. Retired colonels offering to make statements. Active duty officers volunteering to file complaints. Officers still serving saying they could make something happen if he wanted. The veteran community, sensing that one of their own had been diminished, was mobilizing. Thank you, Harrison told each of them. But this will resolve itself. I believe in the system. At Fort Campbell, Colonel David Harrison was in his commanding officer's office. General Margaret Whitaker sat behind a desk that had seen 1,000 difficult conversations. Your father is the General Robert T. Harrison? She asked. When David confirmed it, she leaned back. He trained my father. He was legendary. He still is, ma'am. Then we need to make sure this is handled correctly. What handled correctly meant in Whitaker's mind was a visit. Not an official visit. Just a general stopping by to check on the veterans in her region. Just a welfare check. Nothing unusual about that. She called the Veterans Affairs office. Carol, I'd like to visit the office tomorrow. Just a welfare check on our veterans. Carol's voice changed. Of course, General. That would be wonderful. Carol didn't tell Garrett. She didn't tell anyone. But she had a feeling something was about to happen. The kind of feeling you get when you sense the air pressure changing before a storm arrives. Garrett felt it too. That afternoon, his supervisor called him in. Tom, I've been hearing some complaints about your conduct at the Veterans Affairs office. From who? From people in town. People who know that veteran. People who know who he really is. I don't care who he is. I was doing my job. Were you? Or were you using your badge to bully an old man? Garrett didn't answer. Stay out of trouble, Tom. I'm watching you. That night, Garrett couldn't sleep. He lay next to his wife in their bed, listening to her breathe. He felt the walls of his life getting tighter. Something had shifted. Something was coming. He didn't know what. But the sense of danger. Real danger. Not the artificial danger of a patrol car or a confrontation with a drunk. But real danger. It settled into his chest and didn't leave. The next morning, General Margaret Whitaker walked into the Veterans Affairs office at 10:15. She was in civilian clothes, slacks, a blouse, a light jacket. She looked like what she was, a professional woman in her early 60s, nondescript, unremarkable. To anyone looking at her, she was just another person coming in to handle government business, except for how she carried herself. There was something in the way Whitaker moved through space. Not aggressive, not domineering, just present. The kind of presence that comes from having made decisions that affected thousands of lives, from having lived with the consequences of those decisions, from having learned that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. She looked around the office. Carol at her desk. 2 other Veterans Affairs employees in the back. 1 client waiting. And Officer Thomas Garrett, who happened to be there for his regular welfare check. Carol saw Whitaker and stood up. Her entire demeanor changed. "General Whitaker." "Welcome." Whitaker smiled. Genuinely. Not the smile of someone performing authority, but the smile of someone comfortable in their own position. "Just visiting. Wanted to check on our veterans. Is General Harrison here today?" The word general landed in the room like a physical object. Garrett's head snapped up. His eyes moved from Whitaker to Carol to the door, processing what he'd just heard. General. She'd called Harrison a general, which meant. Garrett's internal clock was running faster now, his heart rate up, his hands feeling slightly disconnected from his body. Whitaker turned to Garrett with the kind of polite interest one might show toward a piece of office furniture. "And you are Officer Thomas Garrett, Kentucky State Police," he said. His voice sounded strange to him. Too high, too fast. "I see. Officer Garrett. I've heard about you." Those words, that simple statement, contained within them the understanding that Whitaker knew who he was, knew what he'd done, and that this knowing was not good for him. Garrett's face went white. "Ma'am, I was just conducting a routine." Whitaker cut him off without raising her voice. "I understand you had an interaction with General Robert T. Harrison earlier this week. I'll need a full report of what happened. I'm not interested in explanations. Not yet." "Where's the general?" "He's not here today," Carol said quietly. "He was here earlier this week, but not today." "I see. Then I'll need a full report of what happened." Garrett tried to explain. He tried to make it sound casual, something minor, a misunderstanding. "Ma'am, I was just conducting a routine check. I noticed the medals and—" "You noticed medals," Whitaker said. "Tell me, Officer Garrett, what do you know about the Distinguished Service Medal?" "It's a military decoration. It's a decoration given to military officers for exceptional service in combat or in command. It's one of the highest honors in the United States Army. General Harrison has 2 of them. Do you know how many I have?" Garrett shook his head. "1. I have 1. General Harrison earned his 2nd one in the Gulf War. He commanded a battalion of over 600 soldiers. Do you know what that means?" Garrett didn't answer. "It means he was responsible for the lives of over 600 people. It means decisions he made could have resulted in their deaths or their survival. He kept every single one of them alive and brought them home to their families. Families that got to say goodbye to people they thought they wouldn't see again. And you," Whitaker paused. "You laughed at that." The office was completely quiet now. The other Veterans Affairs employees had stopped working. The client in the waiting area wasn't reading anymore. Everyone was watching. Everyone understood what was happening. "Officer Garrett, when I was a captain general, Robert T. Harrison was my battalion commander. He trained me. He showed me what leadership means. He showed me that authority comes with responsibility. That a rank, a badge, a position of power. These things aren't weapons to use on people weaker than you. They're trusts. You don't use them to diminish people. You use them to elevate people, to protect them, to make them understand that their service matters." Whitaker's voice never raised. She didn't need to. The weight of her words was pressure enough. What you did was use authority without responsibility. That's not a police officer. That's a bully with a badge. And I don't know what your career looks like going forward, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that it's not going to look like what you're imagining right now. She turned away from him. Turned to Carol. "Carol, I'm filing a formal complaint with the Kentucky State Police on behalf of the United States Army." This constitutes harassment of a military officer based on military status. It also violates the mutual aid agreements between state law enforcement and military installations. This will be handled at federal level. Then Whitaker left. She walked back out to her car, drove away, and left the office in shock. Garrett stood there, unable to move. The realization was finally complete. He didn't just disrespect an old man, he disrespected a general, and that general's network included active-duty military officers, and those officers included people with actual power. And now the entire machinery of military justice was going to focus on him like a spotlight. He tried to think about what happened next, but his mind was too fast, running in circles, unable to land on anything. By that afternoon, his supervisor called him in. Captain Reynolds had the formal complaint in front of him, 47 pages, signed by General Margaret Whitaker on behalf of the U.S. Army. It was professional. It was detailed. It was absolutely devastating. Tom, the United States Army has filed a formal complaint against you. Do you understand what that means, ma'am? That's the second time you've tried to explain. Don't. Just listen. A general from Fort Campbell visited our facility to check on our veterans. Do you understand who General Robert T. Harrison is? Garrett didn't answer. A retired officer who trained half the command structure at Fort Campbell. A retired officer who the Army considers one of its most distinguished servants in the last 50 years. You mocked him. You used your badge to intimidate him. And now the Army is investigating. Reynolds pulled Garrett's personnel file. He pulled his complaint history. What he found made him put his head in his hands. Complaints. Multiple complaints. Aggressive behavior in 3 separate traffic stops. A woman who claimed he'd used unwarranted force during a DUI arrest. A business owner who alleged extortion, or close enough to it that it warranted investigation. Disrespect, bullying, authority without accountability. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. And now the pattern had a spotlight on it. Tom, you're suspended as of right now, Reynolds said. Turn in your badge. The Army's investigation is going to determine if you'll ever wear this badge again. But I can tell you right now, when the Army is involved, when we're talking about federal violations and military conduct codes, it doesn't end well for people like you. Garrett turned in his badge. He handed Reynolds the physical object that had defined him for 8 years. As soon as it left his hand, something essential left him too. He walked out of the police station with no job, no authority, and the dawning realization that everything was about to change. The story hit the news 2 days later. Sarah Chen, a local journalist who'd been curious about Garrett's behavior for months, picked up the thread from sources in the police department. The Army complaint was discoverable under Freedom of Information Act requests. The details were public. And the detail of a retired general being mocked at a Veterans Affairs office was the kind of story that made people angry. Her investigative report aired on the 6 o'clock news. Police officer suspended after disrespecting retired general. A local officer's conduct toward a decorated veteran has resulted in suspension and an Army investigation. Sarah included everything. The incident, Garrett's history of complaints, the Army's formal intervention, context about Harrison's distinguished military career, interviews with local veterans who spoke about Harrison's reputation. The story was sympathetic to Harrison and devastating for Garrett. Within hours, it was everywhere. General Harrison started trending locally. Veterans from around Kentucky shared the story. Other people who'd had encounters with Garrett, who'd been bullied, intimidated, or disrespected, suddenly felt safe coming forward. Not about Harrison, but about Garrett, about the pattern. By the next morning, it was national news. CNN picked it up. Cop suspended after mocking decorated veteran. Fox News covered it. Military justice. Former officer faces federal investigation. The New York Times wrote a profile when a police officer mocks military service. Garrett became a cautionary tale. His face was on screens across the country. His name was synonymous with authority abuse. His mistake, which he thought was minor, a small moment of bad behavior that would be forgotten, had become a symbol for something much larger. The contempt of people with badges for people with different kinds of authority. Social media made it worse. His Facebook page was flooded with comments, not polite disagreement, but genuine anger. 47,000 shares of the story, 200,000 comments. His face was memorialized on 10,000 posts about respecting veterans. Videos of his patrol car were extracted from online databases and reposted with commentary. This is the cop who mocked a general. His past emerged. Investigative sites dug up his college records, unremarkable. His high school, bullying allegations, now in digital form. His juvenile records, sealed. But rumors suggested assault. Every piece of his history was examined and re-examined. Meanwhile, his personal life collapsed. His wife had filed for divorce within a week of his suspension. Not just any divorce, a divorce with prejudice, meaning he couldn't remarry his ex-wife if he wanted to later. Her lawyer issued a statement. Officer Garrett's conduct is not only a violation of law, but a violation of basic human dignity. This conduct makes him unsuitable as a role model for his children. She got full custody. He got supervised visitation. She took the house. He got to find an apartment somewhere. His parents stopped answering his calls. His mother watched the news story and cried. His father, who'd been a cop in a different era with different standards, said to him once and only once, "You brought shame on the family. I don't want to talk to you." Friends from the police force didn't return texts. Colleagues he'd worked with for years found reasons to not be around him. He was radioactive, untouchable, alone. He tried to contact Harrison. He called the house and Michael answered. "My grandfather doesn't want to speak with you. Please just tell him I'm sorry." Being sorry doesn't restore respect. Being sorry doesn't undo what you did. Being sorry is just the first step. The line went dead. Garrett wrote a letter. He poured everything into it. Genuine remorse. Understanding of what he'd done. Recognition that he'd violated something sacred. He sent it to the address he found online. It was returned unopened. Meanwhile, the Army completed its investigation. Colonel James Martinez from the Inspector General's office led it. 47 pages of meticulous documentation. Interviews with Harrison. Interviews with Carroll and other witnesses. Interviews with other veterans Garrett had wronged over the years. Interviews with police department personnel. The investigation took 2 weeks. The findings were clear. Garrett had deliberately targeted Harrison. Garrett had mocked military service. Garrett had used his position of authority, his badge, to intimidate and humiliate someone who had no badge but who had actual authority. Garrett had violated federal law through the mutual aid agreements between state law enforcement and military installations. Garrett had done this not once but as part of a pattern. The Army's recommendation was unambiguous. Criminal charges, federal investigation, permanent termination from all law enforcement. The Kentucky Attorney General's office got involved. They reviewed whether to file state charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office was already reviewing federal charges. Garrett was facing state abuse of authority, state harassment, federal civil rights violation, misuse of federal liaison authority. He hired a lawyer. The lawyer looked at the case and said, "Tom, you're guilty. The evidence is overwhelming. The best thing we can do is negotiate the terms of your exit." The lawyer tried. The police union tried. But the Army's complaint was federal, and when the federal government is involved, when the military is involved, there's no negotiating. There's just compliance. Captain Reynolds held a press conference. "We want to be clear. Officer Garrett's conduct does not represent the values of the Kentucky State Police. We take our responsibility to the veteran community seriously. Officer Garrett has been terminated effective immediately, and we support the Army's investigation and any criminal charges that may follow. The termination was final. Garrett was no longer a police officer. His certification was revoked. He was permanently barred from law enforcement in Kentucky and would be added to a national database. That database prevented him from being hired in any state. In court, Garrett faced the judge, faced Harrison in the gallery, and pleaded guilty to all charges. Not because his lawyer thought it would help, not because he thought there was any way out, but because looking at the evidence, he realized that any other course of action would be an insult to everyone in the room, and he'd already insulted enough people. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm guilty. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I abused my authority. I disrespected someone's service. I did things that were illegal and immoral. I deserve whatever punishment this court sees fit." The judge sentenced him. State prison, 18 months. State probation, 5 years. State consequence, permanent loss of police certification. Federal prison, 12 months consecutive. Federal fine, $15,000. Federal consequence, permanent revocation of all law enforcement credentials and requirement to undergo psychological treatment. Total sentence, 30 months in federal prison. Garrett was led away in handcuffs on a Tuesday afternoon, in front of cameras, in front of reporters, in front of the entire community that now knew his name and knew what he'd done. His life as he'd known it was over. 30 months later, Garrett was released. He walked out of federal prison in Kentucky on a Tuesday morning. Nobody was there to greet him. He had $90 in discharge pay and a bus ticket to the halfway house that would be his home for the next 2 years. He had 5 years of probation ahead of him. He had a permanent mark on his record. He would never wear a badge again. He would never have authority again. He would never be hired by any law enforcement agency in America. He was nobody now. But something had happened during those 30 months. In prison, he'd had time to think. Not the kind of thinking he was used to. Reactive, defensive, angry. But actual thinking. Processing. Understanding. He'd read books on leadership. He'd attended anger management classes. He'd talked to a prison psychologist who wasn't sympathetic but was persistent. And slowly, painfully, he'd begun to understand what he'd done. Not just the surface of it, mocking an old man's medals, but the deeper violation. He'd used power to diminish someone. He'd used authority without responsibility. He'd proven by his own actions that he was precisely the kind of person who shouldn't have authority. When he got out, he needed work. No company would hire him. No retail store wanted his name in their system. Nobody wanted to employ the cop who'd mocked a general. He found himself at a halfway house in Louisville talking to a counselor about employment options. The counselor said, "You ever think about helping people like you, people who've made mistakes and are trying to rebuild?" Garrett had thought about it. It seemed impossible. "We have a position here," the counselor said. "It's not much money, but it's work. You'd be doing intake interviews, helping newly released people understand their options." Garrett took the job. The halfway house had gray walls and the smell of institutional coffee and humanity trying to rebuild. The work was hard. The people he helped didn't trust him. They had good reasons not to trust authority figures. But Garrett understood them in a way most counselors couldn't. He'd lost everything. He'd faced the consequences of his own failure. He was still living in those consequences. He started with Marcus, a 26-year-old released after serving 5 years for assault. Marcus wouldn't make eye contact during their intake interview. Marcus assumed everyone hated him. He'd been in prison. He had a felony. Nobody would hire him. Nobody would trust him. Garrett recognized the spiral of despair because he'd felt it. "I used to have authority," Garrett told him. "Wore a badge. And I used it like a weapon. Used it to make people feel small." He paused. You're not going to feel big again for a while. But you're not staying small either. That's the choice in front of you." Marcus looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw something in Garrett's face that suggested this wasn't a comfortable social worker who'd never fallen. This was someone who'd been broken and was still being rebuilt. "You talking from experience?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Garrett said. "The worst kind." Months passed. Years passed. Garrett worked at the halfway house helping people rebuild their lives. He attended mandatory counseling. Part of his sentence, but also because he understood now that he needed it. He paid his probation fees. He went to AA meetings. Not because he had an alcohol problem, but because the meetings taught him something about humility and admitting you were wrong and the possibility of change. He rented a studio apartment. It wasn't much. Just enough space for a bed, a small kitchen, a chair, a table. He'd had more once. A house, a family, status, respect. Now he had less. Just enough to know he was trying. Meanwhile, something was happening at a much larger scale. After Garrett's conviction, Kentucky law enforcement began to change. The incident became a case study in police academies. Authority without accountability was the title of a module taught in every police training program in the state. The state legislature passed new legislation, the Harrison Protection Act, which defined harassment of veterans as a specific crime with enhanced penalties. Police departments across Kentucky implemented new training on respect for military service. Joint training sessions were established, military and police working together, learning from each other, understanding that authority comes from different places but comes with the same responsibility. Other victims of Garrett's abuse came forward. A woman he'd pulled over during a traffic stop and intimidated. A young man he'd roughed up during an arrest. A business owner he'd effectively shaken down by threatening repeated inspections unless things changed. Over a dozen people, each with their own story of being bullied by someone with a badge. Their cases were reviewed. Some resulted in appeals. Some resulted in charges being dropped. Some resulted in settlements. The state paid out over $2 million in compensation. But the larger change was cultural. The United States Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs held a hearing. The title, Protecting Veterans from Harassment and Abuse of Authority. General Robert T. Harrison was invited to testify. He sat before Congress on a Tuesday morning, 89 years old, in full uniform even though he was retired, a choice that surprised some people until they understood the symbolism. He was representing not just himself but every veteran who'd been disrespected by someone who confused authority with power. A senator asked him, "General Harrison, Officer Garrett is in prison. Justice has been served. How do you feel about that?" Harrison paused. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "Justice isn't my primary concern, Senator. Accountability is. And accountability has happened. Officer Garrett will serve his sentence. He will face consequences. But the real question isn't whether he faces consequences. The real question is whether our culture will change. Whether we'll teach respect for service again. Whether we'll understand why sacrifice matters. Why those who give deserve respect." He leaned forward. His voice carried the weight of 60 years of military service. "This isn't about me. It's about the next general, the next soldier, the next person who served and came home hoping to be treated with dignity. Officer Garrett will be released someday. He'll rebuild his life. But the system that allowed him to have authority without understanding what authority means. That system needs to change. That's what I want Congress to focus on." The testimony lasted 45 minutes. It was broadcast on every news channel. Clips of it were shared millions of times. Veterans groups cited it constantly. It became a rallying cry for change, though neither Harrison nor Congress used any particular word. Fort Campbell held a special ceremony. General Margaret Whittaker organized it. Over 1,000 soldiers attended, standing in formation on a parade ground in Kentucky, wearing dress uniforms, holding flags. Whittaker stood next to Harrison as soldiers marched past. Each unit saluted. Each officer bowed slightly. "General Robert T. Harrison," Whittaker announced, "has served this nation with distinction and honor for over 40 years. He has trained leaders. He has shaped command. He has shown what it means to use authority with responsibility. In his honor and in recognition of his service, Fort Campbell is establishing the Robert T. Harrison Leadership Institute for Ethics and Authority." A new building was unveiled. It was modest by military standards. 2 stories. Modern but not flashy. Inside there would be classrooms, there would be case studies, there would be training for military officers on ethical leadership, and what it means to have power without abusing it. The institute became real. Within 5 years it operated in 15 states. It trained over 5,000 professionals annually. Military officers, police officers, federal agents, first responders, all learning from one man's example about what respect actually means, about what authority actually means, about how you use power to elevate people, not diminish them. The Smithsonian Institution created an exhibit. It was called The Harrison Legacy. Service, respect, and accountability. It featured Harrison's medals, displayed with full explanations of what each one meant and why it mattered. It featured Officer Garrett's badge, not as a trophy, but as a warning about what happens to authority figures who abuse power. It featured investigation documents, testimony videos, letters between Harrison and Garrett, letters that emerged later when both men consented to their release. The exhibit was meant to ask a question that every visitor had to answer for themselves. What does respect actually mean? What do we owe those who serve? What happens when we fail to provide that respect? Michael Harrison's grandson became an advocate for veterans' benefits. The incident that had brought his grandfather to the Veterans Affairs office that Tuesday morning had exposed a system that was failing veterans. Michael spent the next years working to fix that system. He created a nonprofit. He trained volunteers. He helped hundreds of veterans navigate the benefits they were entitled to. When people asked him why he was so committed, he always gave the same answer. Because if my grandfather hadn't been treated disrespectfully, I might never have gotten the help I needed. In a strange way, Garrett's disrespect saved my life. 10 years after his release from prison, Garrett died. He was 68 years old. The death was quiet. Few people knew. No obituary was published. No flowers were sent. He'd died alone in his apartment. A heart attack, the coroner said. And if not for a welfare check, he might have lain there for weeks. He'd missed a counseling appointment, and his probation officer had followed up. Michael Harrison was the person who found out. He was in Louisville on business related to his nonprofit when his probation officer contacted him. She explained the situation. Garrett was dead. There was no family. There would be a state funeral. Prisoners' rights. Nothing significant. Michael stood in the rain outside Garrett's apartment building thinking about his grandfather. About grace. About what forgiveness actually meant. His grandfather had taught him something without saying it directly. Just by the way he'd lived through this entire situation. You don't forgive people by letting them off. You forgive them by allowing them to be fully human, to fail, to face consequence, to change, to die having learned something. Michael went to Garrett's funeral. He was the only visitor. After the service, after Garrett was buried, Michael placed a coin on the grave. A tradition. Old, unexplained, but meaningful in its silence. You learned, Michael said to the grave, to the man beneath it, to the ghost of what Garrett had been. That matters. Then he left. 20 years after that Tuesday morning in the Veterans Affairs office, the Robert T. Harrison Leadership Institute had trained over 150,000 professionals. It had become a model for other states. Other cities had created their own versions using Harrison's methodology. The emphasis on ethical authority, on understanding that power comes with responsibility, had slowly begun to change the culture of law enforcement and military leadership across America. General Robert T. Harrison lived to 97. He gave one final public address at a joint military police conference. Officers and soldiers sitting together, learning together. Something that hadn't happened before. Something that started because of what happened in one small Veterans Affairs office. "I'm 97 years old," he told them. "I don't have many speeches left, but I want to tell you about respect. Respect isn't earned through force. Respect is earned through consistency, through character, through understanding that the people you have power over deserve to be treated with dignity. Officer Garrett taught me that some people never learn that lesson, but he also taught me something else. That accountability works. That when we hold people responsible for their actions, they can change, they can grow, they can become better." He paused. His voice got quieter. "When you face disrespect, you have a choice. You can respond with anger, with revenge, with bitterness, or you can respond with purpose. You can ask, how can I make this mean something? How can I make this create change?" I chose the second path, and it's been the most rewarding choice of my life. Not because I got revenge, but because I got to be part of something larger, something that helps people understand each other better. That's what I'm leaving you with, the choice. When you're disrespected, when you face injustice, you choose what happens next. You choose if it destroys you or transforms you. You choose if it creates bitterness or builds bridges. I choose bridges. I hope you do too. The speech was recorded. It was watched millions of times. It became the foundational text for the Harrison Institute curriculum. A documentary filmmaker years later interviewed Garrett's former co-workers. She asked them, "Did you know what he was doing?" Officer Marcus, who'd been with Garrett on that day, said, "We knew something was wrong with him. We just didn't know how wrong. We didn't know that a moment of bad behavior could reveal an entire character. We didn't know that one choice, to mock an old man, could end someone's entire career and expose him to the world. But maybe that's the lesson. Maybe we need to know that. Maybe every choice we make with authority, every time we use the badge or the position or the power, we need to understand that it might be witnessed. It might matter. It might be the thing that defines us." The documentary was called The Choice. It aired on PBS and became required viewing in law enforcement academies across America. In one scene, the filmmaker interviews Michael at his grandfather's grave. "Your grandfather showed grace to the man who disrespected him." The filmmaker says, "Do you think Officer Garrett deserved that grace?" Michael thinks about it, his grandfather's lesson still echoing in his life. "He didn't deserve it," Michael says finally. "Nobody deserves grace. That's what makes it grace." My grandfather understood that accountability and grace aren't opposites. They're partners. You hold someone responsible for what they've done. You let them face the consequences. But you also leave space for them to change. You also allow them to be human. And maybe if they spend enough time understanding what they did, if they spend enough years trying to be better, maybe they earn something smaller than grace. Maybe they earn understanding. Maybe they earn the knowledge that someone somewhere, a veteran, his grandson, understood their journey from destruction to attempted redemption, and found something in that journey worth honoring. The documentary ends with footage of Garrett working at the halfway house. He's older now, worn, but there's something in his eyes that's different from the footage of him as a cop. There's humility. There's the understanding that comes from having lost everything and having to rebuild it. He's counseling a young man who's just been released. The young man is angry, desperate, convinced his life is over. Garrett listens, and when the young man is done, Garrett says something that echoes Harrison's own words. "You're not staying small," Garrett tells him. "That's the choice in front of you. You can stay broken, or you can start building. It's hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But it's possible. I know because I did it. I was the worst version of myself. I used power to hurt people, and I served time for it. But that time taught me something. It taught me that you can't go backward. You can only go forward, and if you go forward with intention, with the understanding that you're trying to be someone worth being, then maybe you have a chance." The young man listens, and something in his face changes. Not hope. Hope would be too simple. But possibility. The understanding that his failure doesn't have to define him forever. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe our channel for more stories about justice, integrity, and the transformative power of grace.